Welcome to this session of the History of Popular Music. This session in particular is Selling Song, the Legacy of Blackface Minstrelsy, and the invention of popular music through printing. There are several things that you can already tell just from the title and the subtitle, right? What we're talking about, obviously, is the printing industry in music. And while printing of music goes back to the very earliest days of the United States, it becomes a big business in both the United States and in Europe around the 1880s. And that's when the industry is really revolutionized in some ways. And that's when the reason that I'm calling this the invention of popular music is because this is when popular music really becomes a mass art, meaning that it is, as you remember from the podcast episode, it is mechanically reproduced, right? The copy that you have is no different, no better or worse than the copy that I have, and it relies on the means of mass distribution as well, right? All those fit with the 1880s, like I said, revolution in the music printing industry. And a lot of the aesthetics and the type of music that's sold early on is a legacy of blackface minstrelsy. So we'll see how all that comes together. This will be a relatively short lecture because, of course, you have podcast episodes or a podcast episode to listen to for this session as well. So even though in the strong sense, the music printing industry doesn't really get up and running until the 1880s, there were, of course, several composers trying to make a living through the publication of their music long before then. And the big name here is, of course, Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster is sometimes called the father of American music. He wrote numerous successful minstrel and parlor songs, over 200 in total. And these include such hits as Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, My Old Kentucky Home, and Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair. For a while, he worked with the Christie Minstrels, one of the most successful minstrel groups of that later period, and we talked about them in a previous session. And he wrote some of his best known works for them. He hoped to transform minstrel music. As he wrote, he wanted to build up taste among refined people by making words suitable to their taste, instead of the trashy and really offensive words which belong to some songs of that order. And we're going to see this again and again in the history of popular music. This idea that you're somehow bringing up popular music out of a kind of base mere popularity into a kind of art form that can be disseminated widely and yet still be art. Now, of course, he's also trying to make a living as publishing, and that's what we'll turn to next. Foster tried to make his living as a professional independent songwriter, but this was not really possible at that time. That would soon change, but at this time it's almost impossible to make a living as a composer through publishing. When he was with the Christie Minstrels, that was a different thing, right? Because he's touring, he's performing, he's being paid a salary by going on tour with them. But he tries to just be a composer, publishing music, and that's much more difficult. And indeed, he died penniless. He died in penury in the Bowery, so he didn't have any money left at his death. Died of basically of alcoholism. In part, he was a victim of his own success. His style was so recognizable that it became easy to copy. And because of the lack of stringent copyright laws at this time, many publishers just put his work out without paying him at all, right? And they would just, if it was published by a different company, they just published their own version of it. What was he going to do? There wasn't a robust copyright law at the time, so he couldn't exactly sue. Still, he was wildly popular. He sold 100,000 copies of Old Folks at Home in 1851 alone, so just in that 1 year. And those are the legitimate copies, right? Who knows how many pirated copies were also sold of that same song. Even publishers who had legitimate right to his songs ripped him off by today's standards. In 1847, he sold Oh Susanna, one of the biggest songs in American history, certainly of the 19th century, for $100 outright. That's it. He gave it to the publisher for $100, and then the rest of the income came from them. And that song produced tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he never made any royalties on that. That's just not how it was done at that time. He tried to negotiate such contracts, but it was quite difficult. Another composer of this period that also published quite a few works is Oliver Shaw, who lived, up to through the first half, roughly, of the 19th century. As you can see here, he's blind, and so that was part of his appeal, and we'll see that again and again in the history of popular music too. This idea of seeing the disabled, especially the blind, perform, right? And we'll see that especially in blues, blind Lemon Jefferson and so on, a whole bunch of these blind guitarists. Oliver Shaw is a pianist and a composer, and he wrote some really, I think, wonderful tunes of that period, but the majority of his income came from being a performer. But already by the 19th century, and certainly in the 20th century, the parlor at home became a central venue within the home, right? And I talk about this a lot in the podcast, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it here. But there was a real need, obviously, for sheet music to have something to be performed in the parlor, right? Something that your daughters usually, or sometimes your wife, or sometimes your other children, your sons, but usually your daughters would play for the entertainment of guests. So, of course, if you're selling sheet music, you also have to sell things to play the sheet music on, right? And this is a period, the 19th century is a period in the U.S. where the piano really reigns as king or queen, or whatever you want to think of as far as the gender of a piano goes. After the Civil War, over 25,000 new pianos a year were sold. And by 1885, over 500,000 young people were studying piano. Right? In 1899 alone, at the very end of the 19th century, 350,000 pianos were made, right? So this is a boom period for the creation of the piano. If you were considered musically literate, and in the 19th century, while you, as a businessman, didn't have to be musically literate in the sense of being able to play, the idea was that someone in your home would play, right? That was part of the culture of the home and the culture of the middle and upper middle class. And this became a kind of cultural attainment as well, right? So even people who couldn't really afford to have a piano would scrape and save in order to have a piano or a portative organ, and we'll talk about that in a second. So as I said, the piano was a quote-unquote needed part of the 19th century parlor for the middle class, right? It demonstrated sophistication, and it played into the belief that one's attainments demonstrated worth beyond one's financial holdings. So this was typical in the 19th century, right? If I was well-read, and I knew a lot about literature, about poetry, and about novels and so on, or I knew a lot about philosophy, then it didn't matter that I wasn't as wealthy as the next person. I had a sort of cultural worth, right? And that added to my social cachet. Right? And the same thing applies to music. Knowing the important pieces by Beethoven, being able to play or have someone in your house play some of them and some pieces by Mozart or whatever, demonstrated a kind of cultural worth that was maybe beyond your actual financial earnings, and that could sometimes lead to greater earnings, because if you were thought of as being as sort of presenting yourself well, then you might be hired in a business where that mattered, right? Or maybe even where it didn't matter, just where your boss thought of you as someone interesting to have around. So piano manufacturers produced cheap pianos for this newly invigorated market. Prior to the Civil War, music publishing was integrated into piano sales. And that's kind of obvious, right? I'm buying a piano, so I need some sheet music to take home to play on it. And then I can go back to the same piano dealer to buy more sheet music when I need more. And you still see that at places that sell pianos. You can buy at least some limited sheet music, right? The publishers were dispersed across the country. They weren't centered yet in New York City until the late 19th century. So individual songs had relatively little commercial value. It was the overall group that made money. So I wasn't usually buying a single piece by Beethoven or a single song by Foster. I was buying collections of these things, because that way I have plenty of material to play on my piano, right? When I bought even an electric keyboard, right? I have a electric Yamaha keyboard. It came with a collection of sort of 500, small movements of classical music to play along with it. That was just packaged with it. Well, that was certainly the case back then. Stephen Foster was the exception in that he was able to make a living, sort of, as we were discussing, in publishing music. And also, before the copyright of 1891, publishers could simply pilfer foreign songs and pay nobody. That was very typical, right? If there was a song published in Germany, I could just republish it, and what were they going to do? There was no international copyright laws and no Copyright Act until 1891. Now, one of the key innovations in this period, the very end of the 19th century and then the beginning of the 20th century, was the installment plan, was creating a true consumer capitalism, right? And notice these two different excerpts that I've collected here. There's a 1907 trade magazine. Now, a trade magazine is something that goes to just the people who are selling instruments, right? So people who are selling pianos, or sometimes guitars or whatever. That they would subscribe to these trade magazines, and they would tell you what trends were going on, what to invest in, what you should make sure you have stocked, and so on. Notice how they talk about the installment plan. Selling by installments is a means of appealing not only to the classes, but to the masses. In other words, to those who would not or could not purchase goods on a cash basis. In other words, they're trying to not only appeal to the upper middle class and the upper class, they're trying to appeal to the lower middle class and maybe even the poor. And we'll see that's that becomes an increasingly important market, especially for organs. I mentioned the portative organ before. The portative organ don't think of a church organ. We're talking about a very small organ that is operated in part through a hand pump that you sort of pump it as you play in order to get the wind to move through. And to have the instrument sound out. It's a relatively cheap instrument, but a lot of poor families had it, and that way they had a keyboard instrument in the home. And it's, again, this idea of having cultural attainment beyond your financial attainment. Now, notice the way that the magazine's talking here, right? That you're appealing not only to the classes, meaning the middle class, especially the upper middle class that could afford this, but also to the masses, to the hoi polloi, to the working class, right? And so these are people that wouldn't be able to just come in and buy a piano or whatever else was being sold. Certainly not all at once, right? They're putting things on layaway. They're paying by installment. This is something that a lot of people in the 19th century and before would have thought of as disgraceful. If you can't afford something, you ought not to be buying it. So if you're going to have mass capitalism and consumer capitalism in the way that it comes into being in the early 20th century, you have to change that mindset. And that's what's going on with the next excerpt, right? Same year, 1907, but this is a phonograph catalog. So this is something that would have been bought by people who are purchasing things, not just by people who are selling things. Notice how they put the notion of the installment plan. Buying on monthly installments does not imply, as some seem to think, that your means are limited. It does show that you're adopting the latest practical and most efficient method of saving and purchasing. So it's not that you can't afford things. It's not that your means are limited. It's that you're a smart consumer. Right? So now remember, you're paying a bit of interest when you're paying in installments. It's not like the thing costs $500 and you're just paying in 10 groups of $50. You're paying in 10 groups of $53 or $54. So they're getting extra out of you this way. It's not a way of really saving money. It's not really the most efficient method of saving. It might be the most efficient method of purchasing, depending on what you mean by efficiency. But it's certainly not a way of saving money. And yet they're trying to make you believe that it is because it's a good way for them to earn money. One of the key figures in or set of figures in the publishing industry, the revolution, the music printing revolution of the 1880s is, of course, the Whitmark brothers, right? So here you see their logo, M. Whitmark and Sons. M. Whitmark was their father. He was not part of the business, but they started this business, as we'll see on the next slide, at such a young age that they had to have their father's name on it in order to incorporate the business. They were too young to legally sign the incorporation documents, right? They started off in New York, as we're about to see, but as you can see by this point, they have offices in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, London, and Paris. So they're one of the true moguls of the printing industry, as we'll see. In 1883, the 11-year-old J. Whitmark won an arithmetic competition. And for a prize, he was able to choose among a printing press, a bike, a tool chest, and a baseball uniform. He was sort of going back and forth between the bike and the uniform, but his older brother, Isidore, who was only 14, convinced him to get the press because he figured they could make a little business for themselves, right? And so along with another brother, Julius, who was 13 at the time, they started making New Year's cards and then business cards in their Hell's Kitchen home. They just operated right out of the home. They had a little printing press and they just worked right out of their home on West 40th Street. Now, by 1885, just 2 years later, they had a small business out of the home with a steam printing press so that they could they could manufacture these things even faster. And they convinced their father to help them buy this press and to incorporate the business. The next year, 1886, they began publishing sheet music publishing, and had some real success with a song that Isidore wrote called President Cleveland's Wedding March. Now, of course, that's obvious why that would sell, right? It's kind of an ephemeral thing. This is when President Cleveland was president, so it was of the moment in that sense. And of course, President Cleveland had been a bachelor, and so in a very celebrated manner. So it had some topicality to it. And they learned very quickly that the idea here, or the ideal, would be to create songs that would grab people now, make a whole bunch of people buy them, and then they more or less forget about it, so they were on to the next big thing. And soon, sheet music was their main concern. Here we can see what will eventually be Tin Pan Alley, and we'll see another picture in a moment. This is the corner of 5th Avenue and 28th. In the right around 1900, right? So very different than it looks today in a lot of ways, and yet you can get a sense of how this relates to what we see on a more regular basis. And this is where a lot of the music printing industries will set up. The industry started around New York's Union Square and then moved to 28th and 29th between 5th and 6th Avenues. And here worked people such as Irving Berlin, so composers like Irving Berlin and George Gershwin and Jerome Kern. And we tend to talk about this as Tin Pan Alley, right? And Tin Pan Alley, the name there refers to the banging on the keyboards, right? A lot of these keyboards, a lot of these pianos in these offices were relatively inexpensive, right? Especially the ones that weren't in the studio where the clients would come to listen. So just where the songwriters were paired off with lyricists, they'd have kind of crappy pianos, because the idea was you were in a small little room, you had a piano, you had a small writing desk, and there you were composing all day, and you're just banging away at these pianos. And so, as we'll see, a journalist wound up calling this Tin Pan Alley because he said it sounded like people banging on tin pans. With the rise of vaudeville in the 1880s, the publishers began making real money by supplying the shows with new tunes. And so this is the rise of consumer capitalism. And for it to be consumer capitalism, as opposed to just earlier stages of capitalism, you need three basic things. You need unending novelty, because the idea here is you need to create a group of people that we'll call consumers, right? Where that's what we expect them to do. It's not just, well, I need food, so I'm buying food, or I need a table for my house, so I buy a table, then I don't have to buy anything like that, another piece of furniture for a long time. You got to find ways to sell them on things constantly, and one aspect of that is unending novelty. And then you got to convince people to have pleasure in the always new, right? And the Whitmark brothers figured that out early on. That's the whole point of the novelty of the Cleveland song and so on. Then you have to have a production not simply of goods, but also desires, right? I have to make you want things. I have to produce that want in you. And that can be done through advertising. It can be done through all sorts of ways, and we'll see some of them later on in this lecture. And then third, you have to have the promise that consumption was a path to personal fulfillment. That part of what it is to be a U.S. citizen, by the time we get into the early 20th century, is to be a consumer. And that's why you see all this stuff about shopping well, right? About being an intelligent and wise and efficient consumer. What a strange thing to want to be, right? An efficient consumer, right? And it's almost like, oh, well, I can eat my meals in 2 seconds. That's not something that we would take pride in normally in that sense, right? Consuming is a means to an end, not an end in itself. But part of what's happening with the rise of consumer capitalism is that consumption becomes a kind of means, or rather an end unto itself, right? It's something we consume in part from the joy of consuming. You all know this, right? You've all been on Amazon and you see what they recommend. Why? Why are you bothering to see what they recommend? Because you feel like buying something. It's not that you went to Amazon just to buy something specific. You're going to see what's available or go browsing in a store or in a bookstore or whatever. Obviously, this impacts music publishing. And here you have an excerpt from a book on song publishing by Isaac Goldberg, which was published in 1930. He writes, "What you sing and whistle, then, is the result of a huge plot involving thousands of dollars and thousands of organized agents to make you hear, remember, and purchase. The efforts of song promoters assail our ears wherever we go because it is the business of this gentry to fill the air with music." Right? So if I want you to buy music, I want you to hear music that you are going to want to purchase. And what we're talking about here is still publishing, right? More than phonographs. By the time we get to 1930, of course, there is a phonograph industry, and we'll talk about that soon. So that's another element of this. But what he's talking about is really song publishing. The idea that you hear the song. Well, what happens when you hear a song, right? You hear a song, and if it's catchy enough, you're interested in it right away. But think of all the songs that you're like, that one's okay. But then you hear it over and over again, right? I have this experience all the time where I hear a tune on the radio, I'm starting to sing along, or realize I'm starting to sing along, and then I realize, oh, I don't like that tune, right? But obviously it's catchy enough that it's gotten stuck in my head, and something about singing along makes you kind of like it. Participation is one of the key ways to sell someone on something, and that's what Goldberg's talking about here. And we're going to talk about the people that he's talking about in a second. These are the song pluggers, and we're going to get to them in just a second. Now here's Irving Berlin talking about songwriting in a book that he published a decade earlier than that, in 1920. He says that the melody must musically be within the range of the average voice of the average public singer, right? So if you're going to have success as a songwriter, you want to make sure that the melody isn't too operatic. It's not too hard to sing. It's something that most people can sing along to, right? The title. Notice how quickly, really early on, he's talking about the title. The title, which must be simple and easily remembered, must be planted effectively in the song. It must be emphasized, accented again and again throughout the verses and the chorus, right? Think about a lot of these old Tin Pan Alley standards, these old Broadway standards, right? American Songbook standards, as they're sometimes called, by Irving Berlin, Gershwin, and so on. They say the title of the song over and over again. Why? Well, because that way, if you've heard it once, you know the title, because you've heard it. My Blue Heaven. You've heard that phrase over and over again. It gets stuck in your head. Continuing with that book, right? The ideas and the wording must be appropriate for either a male or female singer so that both sexes will want to buy and sing it, right? You don't want to alienate potentially half of your clientele. So you make these songs somewhat less specific so that they, a song that says "I love you dearly," it doesn't matter whether that's from a man or a woman, right? Directed to whomever, right? "I love you dearly" applies either way. And a lot of these are, of course, love songs. Well, why? Because who has disposable income is young adults primarily, right? And they're the ones that are going to be buying this stuff, and they're interested in love. The song should contain heart interest, right? Even if it's a comic song, it should have some kind of sentimental nature to it, because that's what Irving Berlin at least believed was going to make it stick. Song must be original, but let's come back to that in a moment, right? So it's got to stand out in some way. It's got to have novelty. Your lyric must have to do with ideas, emotions, or objects known to everyone. So it must be original, but at the same time, it's got to be familiar. And that's a trick, right? Obviously, when you're talking about publishing popular music, it's got to be familiar and yet original. The lyrics must be euphonious. In other words, they must rhyme. They must have a nice sound to them. They shouldn't be ugly. And the song must be perfectly simple, right? Not complicated. And he feels that the key to success is that the songwriter must look upon his work as a business. This is Irving Berlin. He's a songwriter that many of us revere as being a great artist, right? But he's thinking of this as a business. And indeed, he bragged that he would write at the height of his career, he would write a minimum of 10 songs a day, right? And he'd get up and work for a certain amount of hours, and that would be that. And he'd just crank them out, right? Just like John Grisham cranks out novels. He gets up, I forget what, I read this in an interview somewhere. He gets up at like 5 in the morning. He writes for a set number of hours, and when that time's done, that's done. And he does that every single day, right? Now, I'm not certainly John Grisham, whether you think he's a good writer or not, doesn't matter. He certainly approaches what he's doing as a business, right? Now, the Whitmire brothers realize certain aspects of the business nature of all this in some interesting ways. One of the things that they invent is the use of professional copies, right? So this is a professional copy. You can see two the musical and singing members of the theatrical profession. The performing rights of the song are unconditionally released to those who are selected to have copies submitted for the consideration for professional use. So what these were for is they're not for sale. What you do is you find some performers, an orchestra or a singer, and you send them free copies. And the Whitmire brothers were quite sophisticated in this. Remember, Isidore was a musician, so he would create a bunch of different arrangements. And he would do that for free, because the idea is that if you start playing their song over and over again in your shows, and a lot of these orchestras had shows that they played every night, sometimes multiple times a night, and they're playing your song, then people are going to want to buy that song, right? And they're going to be encouraged to play that song because you've given them free copies of the song, the free rights to sing it, and free arrangements that they didn't have to do. Orchestra leaders have a lot to do. They're not going to want to have to create arrangements for every single song that they're trying out, right? So the idea that there's a prefabricated arrangement makes this easier on them. The easier you make things on them, the more likely they are to play the song. And the more often they're likely to play the song. The more often they play the song, the more likely you are to sell it. Here's a picture of Tin Pan Alley from that period, and you can see Whitney and Warner and Jerome Remnick. So a bunch of these music publishing companies here. And as I mentioned before, the Tin Pan Alley was supposedly coined by the newspaperman Monroe Rosenfeld to describe the tinny sounds of the pianos coming as the sound poured out onto the street. This is a picture I took shortly after actually, I guess a bit after I moved to New York. It's from 2008, and that's what it looked like, or what it did look like in 2008. It might have changed since then. The song industry emerged, therefore, with the publisher at the top, right? Not the composer, not the lyricists, but the publisher was at the top. And then there was a staff arranger that could set the tune for different forces and occasions, like I said with Isidore, professional copies. Then you had the songwriters. They were the next down on the hierarchy, right? And they were relatively formulaic. There was a lot of copycat kind of stuff going on. The titles were of the utmost importance, as we saw with Irving Berlin. In fact, some of the publishing firms had writers that their entire job was just to come up with titles that they could give the songwriters, and then they could flesh them out in the full song. So just catchy titles that they thought would sell. And some of them, that was their entire job. Of course, once you are trying to sell the song, once you have a song, right? So basically what you have here, if you're thinking about a publishing firm, is you have the publisher, of course, and whatever managers they've hired. You got the guy writing song titles. We'll get to the person making the sheet music in a moment. But of course, you also have a bunch of rooms with just songwriters and lyricists, and they're working together to create these songs. Once they have a set of songs they like, they try them out for the publisher. Publisher says, okay, these are the ones I think are the best. Then he tries to sell them to clients, people who run music counters at places like Woolworths and Macy's and so on. These department stores used to sell sheet music on a regular basis, right? And so he would have sales representatives from those places come. They would sit in this showroom. That's what you're seeing here. The composer would come out, and usually the lyricist was also a singer, and so the lyricist would sing the song, and they'd perform their songs for the sales representative, and then the sales representative would talk to the publisher about what to buy and what not to buy. Once it seemed like a song was going to sell and you've gotten past the whole professional copy stage and people are ready to buy this thing, then you create a a sales copy, right? A commercial copy. And here you can see the sheet music cover artist, whose job it was to design. You can see he has quite a spacious office, much bigger than even Gershwin's office on Tin Pan Alley, right? So he has room to work out different sheet music covers, right? Because the idea is that's going to catch the eye and people are going to want to buy it. A lot of times you're buying sheet music not just because you know the song well. I mean, after all, you're buying probably several pieces of sheet music at once. You see a cover that you think is particularly attractive, that might encourage you to buy it. And so you have this multiple color printing that's going on, which was a fairly new innovation at the turn of the century. And here you can see the sheet music for Bright Eyes, right? And it's quite an attractive design, right? Has the information on it about who wrote the lyrics and who wrote the music. This one comes from a musical, from a Broadway musical, and so there's the book, the libretto for the musical as a whole, and that person's listed. And you can see the with is really the singer. Well, the second one is the singer, and that helps to sell it too, to have the singer's name on there. And then of course at the bottom you can see Whitmark and Sons, right? Some of these covers were not necessarily all that elaborate, and yet were so celebrated that they would appear as backdrops for theatrical performances. That's what happened in 1899 when Florenz Ziegfeld, one of the great impresarios, and we'll talk about him soon enough, he used the sheet music for this song as a backdrop for one of his stage shows, right? On November 1st of 1894 in Cincinnati, this was the founding of Billboard magazine, and that, of course, is at first a magazine that's all about the music industry. Well, really, it's a trade paper for bill posting industry, for advertising industry, and it carried news of outdoor amusements and then included minstrel shows and other musical events. So music was just part of what it did at first. It was really just advertising in general for these events, but music became more and more a part of what it did. And then it begins publishing music charts with the rise of the jukebox industry in the 1930s. And of course, Billboard magazine is still a huge part of the music industry, just in part just tracking what's popular and what's less popular. Then of course you have the song pluggers, and I mentioned them briefly already. Let's talk about them a bit. What they're doing is they're going out to they're doing all the selling, right? They're going out to get professionals to sing their songs. That's stage one for them, right? Trying it on the dog is the slang that they used. They would print 5,000 or so copies of a professional edition on very cheap pulpy paper without artwork, right? What's the point in having artwork? The idea is just to sell it to professionals, and you don't even need to have great paper here because you're not really selling it. You're giving away these copies, right? And so you find stage two, you find local performers, people who don't necessarily have a huge name, but maybe have a local following, and you try it with them first. Then you make trade copies on better paper with artwork, and this is where the real plugging begins. So what you do is you sell it first at a reduced rate to test the reaction, right? If sheet music usually costs, I don't know, let's say 7 cents, you sell it for 5, right? The sellers then had inducement to sell these pieces. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, what I don't mean is you're not selling it. If it's 7 cents is the usual price, you're not selling it to the customer for 5. You're selling it to Woolworths or Macy's for 5 cents is what I'm saying, right? So let's say that the usual cost would be 7 cents per copy, and Woolworths or Macy's sells it for 10 cents a copy, right? And they're making a 3 cent profit. What you're doing now is you're saying, no, I'll give it to you for now at 5 cents. So now they're making a 5 cent profit, right? 50% profit. They're going to want to try to sell that out. They're going to want to try to sell all the copies that they bought for 5 cents. They're going to want to sell those out because they make more profit that way. So they're more likely to push it, to put it at the front of the counter, to get the woman that works at the counter, it was usually a woman, working at the music counter. They're going to try to get her to push these songs, and that's going to make the song a little more popular, right? Stage 5 is you put advertisements in trade publications like Billboard and so on, and free distribution to professional singers. Now you're trying to get in the big names, the names that people would recognize on a larger than just immediately local basis. Then stage 6, you have the pluggers go out to the stores, to ball games, to racetracks, prize fights, public parks, Ivy League dances, riverboats, elevated trains, political rallies, and they get audiences to participate with these chorus slips. So what you do is you have the chorus of the song that you put on a slip of paper. You go into, say, a subway car, you hand it out, you start singing the song, everyone can join in on the chorus. Why? Because if you're singing along, then you're already buying into this in some way. If you get hooked by participation, that's a big part of how things are sold, right? And so, yeah, the way that Take Me Out to the Ball Game was originally sold was the pluggers went to these ball games, handing out chorus slips, and everyone's singing along, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, right? And so it became a huge hit song. You go to the Woolworths counter, and you kind of flirt with the customers and play piano and sing the song. And that'll get people to buy it. So your typical day as a song plugger is the 10 a.m. You're at the publishing house to get the music and the chorus slips. You wait for your assigned times at various department stores to perform. You bribe the sales girl to push your songs with gifts of perfume. In fact, even some of the songs were about how cute the girl at the music counter was, so that the idea was to flatter them into selling these songs. Then from, you do that for a good bit of the day. From 7 to 10 p.m., you're plugging in theaters and Nickelodeons and movie houses. So sometimes you would even perform during the intermissions of these movies and shows, right? With song slides instead of the chorus slips, you have the slides that you project. So they're colored photographic slides depicting the narrative, and sometimes they'll have parts of the lyrics and so on. And you try to reach about 10 movie houses, and thus roughly 5,000 people in a night, right? And then the pluggers would plant boosters in the vaudeville crowds to request, quote unquote, request their songs. They're shills, right? They're people that are paid to say, hey, why don't you sing this song? And then if the performer knows it, they'll sing it. And again, just all these ways to get your song in people's heads. A successful songwriter of this period, one of the early successful songwriters of this period, of the great period of publishing, was, of course, Charles K. Harris, who wrote the song After the Ball. That was his huge hit. He was in Milwaukee. He had a sign on his office that said banjoists and songwriters, songs written to order, right? Before his After the Ball, most songs were at best regional hits, but he took the entire country by storm with this song. In 1892, it sold over 2 million copies of sheet music, and it eventually sold well over 5 million, making it the bestseller of all time with respect to sheet music. Its popularity rested in part on aggressive distribution. As he put it in his autobiography, a new song must be sung, played, hummed, and drummed into the ears of the public, not in one city alone, but in every city, town, village, before it ever becomes popular. Also from his autobiography, the real start at popularizing a song is to sell it to the performers. If it strikes their fancy, they'll surely sing it for the public. Common sense tells one that the bigger the reputation and ability of the performer whose assistance the author and composer enlists, the more chances of its success in catching the public's favor. So thus Harris enlisted James Aldrich Libby, who was perhaps the most successful traveling singer of that era, and then also May Irwin, who was very successful on Broadway, and Dick Jose, who was successful on the West Coast, and Helen Mora, who was successful in vaudeville, and he would try to curry favor with these four singers. This song gained an even greater reputation because it was featured in the 1893 Columbian World Exposition in Chicago, and was performed by Susan. We'll talk about that later. So here's the sheet music for After the Ball in 1892, and you can see right there J. Aldrich Libby on the cover, and people loved him, so they're likely to buy tunes that they've heard him sing or know that he sings and so on, so they can play them at home. So that's it for this session. I'll see you at the next.